All right, good morning. Sorry about that. We were just visiting and just lost track of time, so let me get us going here. So we're only about a minute behind. And Rex, would you mind getting us started?
Gracious Jehovah, we thank you so much for giving us another day in which we can gather together as thy children and study thy word. Be with Eric as he directs our study this morning. Heavenly Father, help each of us to open our hearts, take the teachings from the Gospels, that we might learn to live more righteously in thy sight. Forgive us of our transgressions, Father. Be with those who are traveling this holiday weekend and bring them safely home. Through Christ Jesus we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Rex. So again, apologize. We were just visiting and talking hiking, and next thing you know, it's like, oh, running late. But one of our favorite topics. So this morning, my assignment was the Good Samaritan, the story out of Luke, the parable out of Luke. Really, it starts off in verse 25, goes through verse 37. So we'll be covering that. This is probably one of the very well-known parables of the Bible. So most people that you come in contact with, even if they're not a Christian, they probably have heard about this. We have hospitals that are named Good Samaritan Hospital. We have laws. We have Good Samaritan laws. So that's how well known this parable is and the story and the context here. What we're going to talk about is what lessons do you think Jesus intended to convey to us through this parable? And we will explore that context this morning. We're going to delve into the key teachings that Jesus may have wanted to emphasize for us. So that's the intention here. And we'll go ahead and get started. As is typical for me, I'll keep it really simple on the slides, just a few bullet points for you, and really focus in more on reading the text and spending time on the text. So let's go ahead and get started on verses 25 through 29. So, and this is where the lawyer asked Jesus a question. So, and behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And he said to him, "What is written in the law? What is your reading of it?" So he answered and said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered rightly. Do this, and you will live." So I want to hold off on 29 till we get there. But so first off, let's think about a lawyer in the context of those times. So what is a lawyer at that point in time? It's not what we would think of today, someone that knows civil and criminal law that would maybe defend or file a complaint for you. It's not the same thing. The lawyer in the context of that time frame for those folks was they were experts in the Mosaic law. So they understood the laws of Moses. And they were experts. They could recite them forward, backward. They knew them better than anybody. And that was their whole livelihood. That's what they did. Now, why is this lawyer standing up and asking? So by inference, I would suggest that the lawyer was drawing attention to himself by standing, because this would infer if he had to stand up, others were sitting down. So he was standing up. He wanted people to look to him. He wanted to talk. He wanted to ask this question. Is it necessarily a bad question? Do you think? Do you think he was antagonizing Jesus at the moment?
It says in verse 25 that they're using tests. So they were testing Jesus.
Yeah, they were testing. They're constantly testing and poking at Jesus to find some sort of a flaw to catch him. Now, the question by itself isn't necessarily wrong. Like, what is it? What do I need to do? But considering the person asking it, you know what to do. And Jesus points him back to the law. Jesus answers the question by pointing him back to the law. Very much like in Luke 10. So in a similar manner, Jesus points the rich young ruler to the law in Luke. In here, he's pointing the lawyer to the law. Now keep in mind, at this time, the lawyers, they knew the law. They knew the Mosaic law. And the lawyer replies with a proper understanding of what the law taught concerning eternal life. Let's remind ourselves. So he answered and said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." So the lawyer understands. He understands the law. He knows what he needs to do. He knows what the law says. In doing so, Jesus reinforces the law. Because remember, Jesus didn't come to change the law. Not by one jot, not by one tittle. He was not going to change the law. So he points them to the law. And the lawyer replies with a perfect understanding of the law. So why is the lawyer asking? He's poking. He wants to see what Jesus has to say. Upon these two laws, one to love God, the other to love your neighbor, the entire law was based. So those living while the law was still in force could live. But the lawyer's not finished. He still wants to poke. And this is where you get into lawyerliness. He desires to find some sort of flaw. So what he says next is, "But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?'" So this would, to me, might suggest, first off, he looks at the first part, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. So he's not fixated on that. Does that suggest maybe he feels like he does that? He knows that? Like the rich young ruler? I do all these good things. I live this good life. And he goes to the next thing, point 2. So what's neighbor? Jesus, tell me, what does a neighbor mean? Now think about this from the context of the Jews at that time. What would be a neighbor to them? And that's what he's asking. What was that?
Another Jew.
Another Jew. Absolutely. Another Jew. How about a Samaritan?
No way.
No way. Absolutely not. What about some other sort of enemy? So the Jews of that time had a practice, and this wouldn't necessarily hold true of all Jews, but it was very common that Jews to Jew, that was my neighbor. My enemy was my enemy. Samaritans, I might suggest they even fall even lower than an enemy. Let's have some notes on that here. So the Samaritans at the time were a mix of already spiritually corrupt Israelites and pagan foreigners. They created a religion for themselves that the Jews considered heresy. So they established as their center of worship a temple on Mount Gerizim, claiming it was where Moses had originally intended for the Israelites to worship. They had their own unique version of the books of Moses, but rejected the writings of the prophets and Jewish traditions. The Samaritans saw themselves as the true descendants of Israel and preservers of the true religion, while considering the Jerusalem temple and Levitical priesthood illegitimate. So to the Jews, a Samaritan was more revolting than a Gentile pagan. Samaritans were half-breeds who defiled the true religion. So that we see some social classing here, some bias. So how they viewed their neighbors and how they viewed others they had a very hard line. And Jesus is about to take them across that line. He's going to encourage them to not look at those lines. And he's going to educate this lawyer. Think about this. This is the expert in the Mosaic law among the people. So the average person would look at this and hold them in some esteem as experts. So they dressed differently, they spoke differently, they knew the law back and forth. They could probably recite it. You just tell me what you want to know and I'll recite the verse for you. And that was their place. So now we're going to jump forward and move into how Jesus responds. So we're going to pick up in verses 30 through 35. Then Jesus answered and said, "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead." Now, Jerusalem to Jericho, you may not think about this, but there's quite a elevation transition. And it's commonly thought that many of the priests lived in the Jericho area, so that road from Jericho to Jerusalem was well traveled. And it's about 17 miles-ish, 17 to 20, depending on who you read and which one you believe, but it's a good distance. So it's probably about a good 8-hour walk at a good pace. Yeah, and it's hills. So you go from Jerusalem is about 3,300 feet in elevation, and you go down to Jericho, which is about 700 below sea level. So you have a pretty healthy transition, and it's through a hillside, caves, rocks, just not an easy walk. Now, going from downhill, maybe a little bit easier, although sometimes I would argue the downhill is more tough on the knees than the uphill. But regardless, it was a very well-traveled road, wasn't an easy walk, and this was called the, if my memory serves me correct, it was, I've seen it referenced as the way of blood. So it was a very dangerous road to travel alone without a guard, without people with you to help provide security and protect you, and was very common at that time. If you were alone, you could get mugged, and that's the story that we're going to walk into right here. Now by chance, picking up on 31, a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So here's a priest. This is someone that should know better, right? They should know the law as well. They should know that they should take care of a neighbor. But what do? Make no eye contact, didn't see him, walk by, step to the other side of the road. I'm too busy. Maybe this is a trap. Who knows? But for whatever reason, the priest passes by. And the priest should know better. We would expect the priest to behave differently and know better.
He did know it.
He just ignored it. He made a choice. So his faith did not have the action that it needed to go with it. So faith without action is no faith, is no good. I think is that James? Yes. So now the story continues on, but a certain Samaritan, likewise a Levite, verse 32, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed by on the other side as well. So here you have the priest, you have the Levite, the helpers of the priest, right? So these are groups of people that should know. They should know better. They should know what to do. They should show compassion. They should help this neighbor, this person in distress. So, but they choose not to. And what are the reasons why you would choose not to help somebody? It's inconvenient. Yeah. What was the last part? They don't talk to each other, like they view as like different class. Yeah. Anybody else?
Well, fear of being wailing was a very common fear.
Fear of being
Wailing.
Waylaying?
If the person
Yeah.
he's just faking it, and
Yeah.
he's going to get jumped.
Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. So it's a trap. Maybe it's a trap. Maybe I don't want to touch that person. Maybe they're dead. I don't want to be unclean for their time. I mean, I don't know. There's probably, I think, we do this in our everyday lives all the time. We come up with excuses, good excuses that we justify in our own minds for not doing the right thing. And I think this example here is probably the exact same thing. We would expect they know what they should have done, but they chose not to do it, and they probably rationalized it in their own minds. That's what humans do. That's what we do. We rationalize our choices. So, at work, we talk about, hey, make a choice, make a decision. You may not always be right. That's okay. But remember, writing a lot of words to rationalize a bad decision, it's still a bad decision. So, and in this case here, they probably were rationalizing this in their brains. They had lots of good excuses. I'm running late. My family might worry about me. This might be a trap. You fill in the blanks. Doesn't matter. Bad choice. bad choice not to help their neighbor. Now, and this is, it's really interesting as you move on to the next, set here as Jesus introduces this in verse 33, but a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was. And when he saw him, he kicked him, looked the other way, and left. That's not what it says. That's not what he did. He didn't go to the other side of the road. What did he do? He had compassion. Now, what does that mean to you? What does compassion mean? If we stop right there and we focus on the word compassion, what does that mean? I didn't hear, I'm sorry. He did something for him. Okay, sorry, I was struggling. Appreciate it. So he did something. Anybody else? No?
Compassion to me feels like the word has more weight than just like caring, like it's like pulling at his heart to really have action to it.
Yeah.
And a desire to help.
He had a desire to help. What if we put the word in, he had empathy? How would that change things? Or would it change things? Put himself in his position? Sure. So he felt, he empathized.
It's just empathy, it's just a feeling, it's not an action.
Yep, empathy, that's exactly where I was going. Empathy is a feeling, not an action. So it's a good choice of words here, right? Jesus is emphasizing to us that it's not the feeling alone. Because you have to empathize, I would argue. You have to have some empathy in order to have compassion to take action. So, because if you don't care, you're probably not going to take action. You're probably not going to have that compassion.
We have a saying, there was no grace in God.
Yeah.
That's why he felt.
Yep. 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 So he had compassion, and it's a very specific word choice, and it's one you want to focus on. Like I've read this thing, hundreds of times, probably like everybody else, and never really kind of dialed in on the word choice, compassion. So it's an action. So it emphasizes not just that you felt for them, you empathized, but you actually did something. You took action. Your action, did something. You had a desire to help that person, to help their situation. Now, so he went on to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. So here's the action. He took action. He used his own supplies, his own oil, his own wine. He attended to the person. He took some action. And, the wine probably had some antiseptic values. The oil maybe softened the wounds. We don't know exactly what all of his wounds were, but we know he was in dire straits. He was in a really bad position, wasn't doing well. But he sacrificed of his own personal stuff. So his oil, his wine, and he puts them on his own animal. So that would suggest to me, at least, that he gave up his ride. So remember, this is a 17-mile trail going downhill, rough terrain. So it's not friendly. And he goes down. He has his own animal to ride, makes it easier on himself, but instead he puts this hurt person, his neighbor, this Samaritan. Remember, for a Jew, think about this at the time, this isn't, they're probably sitting there thinking, okay, well, it's going to be some, average Jewish person comes along, like one of us normal, average Jewish people. And here you go. He saves the day. But no, Jesus makes it a point. It's a Samaritan. So, this, to you and I, that doesn't resonate.
He's not human.
Yeah, Samaritans are no good. They're the lowest of the low. They were below the pagans, the pagan Gentiles. So just the low of the low. Which brings in a whole other interesting debate, because if you think about the Jewish heritage and how they associate that to the mother. If your mother is a Jew, you by birth are a Jew. So I wonder how they reconciled that in their brains then, because I would imagine it wasn't just the male Jews that were mixing race. It was probably both ways, but a study for another time. So here they are. You have this Samaritan, the lowest of the low, and the people are listening to this, and it's this Samaritan that saves the day. Now, the Samaritan goes on. He takes him to an inn and takes care of him. And on the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you." So he attends to him. He gives up his own personal stuff, his oil, his wine. He spends his money. He puts him on his animal, his ride, takes him to an inn, gives money to the innkeeper, 2 denarii. And I think a denarii at that time was probably a day's wages, and maybe 2 denarii at that time would have cared for lodging for that person. What I've read is 2 to 3 weeks, maybe, give or take. Don't know how accurate that is. But regardless, what we see is here's my animal, here's my oil, here's my wine, here's my money. So you have all of this selflessness that's being demonstrated by this Good Samaritan for this person that's hurt, injured, side of the road, and needs help. So you have a priest, you have a Levite. So these are all revered people in the Jewish culture at that time. They walk by and offer no help, no assistance. You have this awful, terrible Samaritan person in the Jewish eyes, and they stop and they help. Think about that from the Jewish perspective. Like, how do you think they're feeling at that moment with that example? What do you think? As Jesus is telling them the story, you have the Samaritan that did the right thing. How do you think they're feeling at that moment? You'd hope they'd feel ashamed. Yeah. That's what I was thinking. I'm sorry, go ahead.
If history says anything from what we've read, it just made them more angry.
Just makes them more angry? Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Because they're having that probably guilt to a certain extent,
Yeah.
or just anger that this man is telling us everything that we've ever done is wrong.
Yeah. He's telling them that anger, it's provoking maybe shame, embarrassment, probably some anger. I mean, I would definitely say anger. Like, because if you think about this is their way of life. So the Samaritans, they're down here. Us Jews, like, we're up here. And that's how they viewed them. And they would treat them. There was no loving relationship between these two groups in any stretch. So the Samaritans didn't like the Jews didn't like the Samaritans. And
Interesting things about that. Not loving the Samaritans was a tradition. It wasn't the law.
yep, it wasn't the law. I mean, if you look at the law as they recited it, you're to love your neighbors. So they knew better, but they weren't following it. So a really good point. So now we'll move on to try and close this up in verse 36. So which of these 3, do you think was a neighbor to him who fell among the thieves? And he said, he who showed mercy on him. Now notice, what didn't he say? What word didn't he use? Samaritan. That is how much discontent between those two groups there is. He wouldn't even use the name. We just saw the story here. We saw who the hero was in the story, and he couldn't even use the name Samaritan. And he said, he who showed mercy on him. Then Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. So the lawyer poses the question, which of the three, Jesus, poses a question, which of the three, proved to be the neighbor? The lawyer replies, he who showed mercy on him. Doesn't even use the word Samaritan. And here Jesus basically admonishes him, the lawyer, in a very, kind way, but it just says, go and do likewise. Here's the example. Go and follow it. Notice that Jesus turned this on the lawyer in a very eloquent way, using a parable. So he pulled the lawyer out with the lawyer's knowledge, had the lawyer demonstrate that the lawyer knows the law. So there's no misunderstanding here. It wasn't, you can't claim that, I was naive to it, I didn't understand it, I didn't know that was the case. He says, yeah, you know the law. So then the lawyer tries, it's a wordplay. So what's this neighbor? Explain neighbor to me. So, because I don't know, maybe the lawyer at this moment is thinking, okay, well, maybe I don't do this to everybody. Maybe there is an issue on this neighbor thing. So you tell me what a neighbor is. And Jesus tells him what a neighbor is without actually telling him what a neighbor is, in a very purposeful way. What was the last part? Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, he probably got more angry because he was told to go act like a Samaritan. So yeah, you could see that would went over well. So that.
We have a little thing on TV, and probably many of us seen it today, but seen it over the past few weeks, but it shows these acts of kindness. And then it comes back and it says, human kindness. And this is what human kindness is. This is compassion.
This is compassion. Absolutely. So, the lessons we can draw from this, at least in my mind, a neighbor is one in need whom we can help. So it doesn't say it's somebody in this group. It could be my neighbor that lives around me. It's anyone I come in contact with. It's anyone I see that is in need of help. Yep. It's everybody. It's everybody. And we need to be careful not to prejudge and not to put people in classes. I think like when we talked about in Jonah, Jonah was making some assumptions about that particular group, about the Ninevites, right? He didn't want to go there. He had made up his mind. We have to be careful not to do that. A neighbor is one in need that we can help, that we have the ability to help. We want to practice pure and undefiled neighborliness. So we want to be good neighbors. That's what we want to do. And above all things, and this is what drives it, we need to be compassionate in our approach to neighborliness. Now, what does that mean? Compassion, as I was trying to emphasize, is action. It requires action. You can't just be empathetic. Empathy's good. I'm not real good at that myself, and that's my wife dials me in a lot. So that is not my strength. Feelings, not me. So she dials me in, but you can't just acknowledge the feelings. You can't just empathize with folks. So you also need to take action. And that's where the compassion comes in, a desire to help and then a willingness to help. And that may mean that you're going to make some sacrifices along the way. It may mean that you don't get to that thing you wanted to get to because you had to take the time to help. It may mean, as in the Good Samaritan in this example, that you had to sacrifice some of your oils and some of your wine to help this person. You fill in whatever the objects are that are yours. So, but there, oftentimes there comes some level of sacrifice or giving up something so you can help the individuals or the peoples. No, I can tell you where we'd be if Jesus had no compassion on us. Yes, be lost. Absolutely. So through the parable of the Good Samaritan, we are called to uphold a higher standard of love, showing compassion and a willingness to assist our neighbors in times of need. So This aligns with Jesus' earlier teaching to his disciples, emphasizing the need to help. And reflect on your own ability to be compassionate. It is only by following what Jesus has instructed us and looking to this parable that Jesus has provided for us. Like, he made sure this was written down. He made sure that we had access to this because he wanted us to know this. And he wanted us to read this. He wanted us to understand it. He wanted us to understand compassion. He wanted us to understand how to be a good neighbor. So my challenge to each one of us then is to do exactly what Jesus said. Let's take what Jesus had to say to us and let's go and do likewise. So this is the example we're given. This is the example that we have. We are all capable of being compassionate, although sometimes we may need a little reminder, and that's okay. But let's go forth and do that. Let's go and do likewise. And I think we got about 2 minutes left. I think we're doing good on time. Any questions, comments? Compassion is love. Absolutely. Go out and love your neighbor. Be compassionate. Compassion is action.
It's kind of like faith. Faith without works is dead. Compassion without works isn't compassion.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's the point I was trying to make with empathy versus compassion. It's like you can empathize, but if you don't take action, then you don't really have the compassion.
Well, empathy, you stand there and look at him. Boy, doesn't he look like he's in trouble.
Yeah.
I really feel bad for him.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's the empathy. But the compassion would be to do something to help, like the Good Samaritan did. Absolutely. Any other comments?
One of the mental processes the Samaritan went through was he overcame the prejudice that he would have against the Jewish people. And sometimes we're called to overcome a prejudice. Maybe we don't like the appearance of this person that has tattoos up one arm and down the other arm, or jewelry hanging from their face.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have to get over that, get past that, to be compassionate.
Absolutely.
We've had it happen in our life.
Mhm.
Had to deal with somebody who's really unusual. It wouldn't be in our comfort zone normally.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. You got to get outside. Don't prejudge.
Yeah, that would
So.
be a big change for the Samaritan, to this group of people that had been cruel to his people, prejudice, and oftentimes they wouldn't have any financial dealings or any of that stuff. There's a lot of implications.
You bet. Awesome. All right. Well, hey, thank you for that last comment there. So appreciate